Nurse Deborah had seen a lot in her 15 years at the public hospital. But when she pushed Gabriel's stretcher, 28 years old, son of the powerful businessman Renato Cavalcante, and when she saw those marks on the back of the boy's head, her knees went weak. They weren't wounds, they weren't scars. They were Sink's 4 symmetrical cavities, as if something inside were slowly consuming the bone. "My God!" she whispered, covering her mouth. He called Dr. Cayo immediately. Cayo Mendez was 38 years old, with worn-out shoes and a lab coat that had been washed so many times it was almost transparent. The son of a laundress, raised in the outskirts of the city, he graduated with a scholarship and lots of cold coffee. He worked 14 hours a day at the only hospital in that region that accepted patients without insurance. When he entered the private room, because Renato Cavalcante required the best room even though it was a public hospital, the shock was immediate. Renato stood there, wearing an Italian suit, a watch worth more than Cayo's car, and a phone to his ear. He barely glanced at the doctor. "How long will it take? I have a meeting at 3. Cayo ignored the comment and approached Gabriel. The young man was conscious, but had been suffering from devastating headaches for weeks. He had already consulted with 5 private specialists in luxury clinics. None had found anything conclusive. Wearing gloves, Cayo gently touched the sunken areas. Gabriel closed his eyes in pain. "Does it hurt here?" Cayo asked, his voice firm and calm. "It hurts everywhere, doctor," the young man replied, exhausted. "I can't work anymore. I can't sleep anymore." That's when Renato hung up the phone and finally looked at the doctor. "Wait, is he in charge of the case?" He frowned, sweeping his worn lab coat, shoes, and unringed hands with a look of disdain. "Where's the department head?" "I'm on duty, sir. I'm Dr. Cayo." "I didn't ask you your name." Renato took a step forward, puffing out his chest. "I asked you where someone is, qualified. You look like you just came out of a favela emergency room." Deborah held her breath. The 2 residents who were with Cayo lowered their heads, embarrassed by the scene. Cayo didn't blink. "Yes, I left," he said calmly. "And I learned a lot there." Renato let out a short, awkward laugh and picked up the phone again. "I'm going to call the hospital director. I want a doctor with curriculum, not with a curriculum of poverty." The comment cut through the air like a knife. Deborah bit her lip. The residents exchanged glances, but Cayo was no longer looking at Renato. I was looking at Gabriel's test results, and what he saw in those images made his heart race. Those holes weren't random. They were a standard. And he had seen that pattern before, just once, in an obscure scientific paper published by a German doctor who died without anyone believing him. Cayo closed the folder slowly. If you support Dr. Cayo, comment Amen below. If you want to know what he discovered in those tests. Cayo asked for silence in the hallway, not with words. She simply raised her hand, slowly, without taking her eyes off the images on the computer screen. The residents stopped. Deborah stopped. Even the noise of the hospital seemed to diminish at that moment. Gabriel's CT scans showed 4 cavities in the occipital bone, the back of the skull. Symmetrical, progressive, as if they were being excavated from the inside. Renato stormed into the hallway, huffing and puffing. "I already called the director. He said you're the only neurosurgeon on call today." He said this as if it were an insult. Unbelievable. My son in the hands of a doctor who doesn't even have a new car. Deborah clenched her teeth. One of the residents, Marcos, 26 years old, a recent graduate, stepped forward indignantly, but Caio stopped him with a calm look. "Okay, Marcos?" "All good," Renato laughed loudly, turning to the others in the hallway as if he were in a theater. "Look at that lab coat. Look at that man. Is this what my income tax is spent on? On second-rate doctors?" A younger nurse ran off to avoid crying in front of the patient. Caio took a deep breath. It went back to the screen, and that's when he found it. Hidden among the reports, almost dismissed by 2 previous radiologists as image artifact. A tiny anomaly in the inner layer of the bone. A spiral erosion, microscopic, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Caio closed his eyes for 3 seconds. It opened. Expansive osteolysis with a spiral pattern and involvement of the dura mater, he said in a low voice, almost to himself. Marcos's eyes widened. Is this the syndrome described by Dr. Hoffman? The one from the 1987 article? The same. Caio was already writing. Progressive, silent, and fatal if not treated within the next 36 hours. The hallway froze. Renato stopped typing on his cell phone. "What did you say?" Caio turned around slowly, with the briefcase in his hand. "Your son has a rare condition of progressive bone destruction that is compressing the cerebellum. If we don't perform surgery tonight, he could suffer respiratory arrest in his sleep." Pause. "Sir." Renato opened his mouth. He closed it. For the first time in decades, the man who humiliated employees for sport, who judged people by the size of their watch, who never apologized to anyone in his life. I was speechless. "Are you sure?" I called Dr. Hoffman Jr., son of the original researcher who lives in Switzerland, Caio said, showing his cell phone. "He confirmed the pattern in 4 minutes. I'm the 3rd doctor in the world to identify this case while still alive." Renato looked at his cell phone, at the screen, at his worn-out lab coat. And for the first time, he didn't see the lab coat. He saw the doctor. I need you to save my son." The voice came out broken, small. The voice of a man who suddenly understood that money couldn't buy what was right. In front of him. Caio looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Gabrielle, who was sleeping restlessly in the room, unaware that death was lurking around his bed. "I'm already preparing the surgical protocol," said Caio, turning his back. But before entering the room, he stopped. Without turning around, he said in a low voice, "The surgery is free, like everything else here." Comment, "Amen," if Dr. Caio deserves respect. Comment, "Strength," if you've ever been humiliated by someone with more money. It was 11:47 p.m. when the doors to the operating room closed. Renato stayed outside. For the first time in his life, he was in the place he always put others, outside of the decision-making process, out of control. No money to solve anything, no phone call to help. Just him, a plastic chair, and the cold corridor of a public hospital. Deborah passed by with a cart full of medicine, and he called her over. "Miss, is he really good? Dr. Caio?" Deborah stopped. She looked at that powerful man, huddled in a $40 chair, his tie loosened, his eyes red. "Dr. Caio," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "turned down offers from 3 private hospitals this year. He turned them down because he said this is where people need his real self." Pause. "Your son is in the best hands in this city, with or without a new lab coat." Renato lowered his head, and she cried. Not the restrained tears of a proud man. The deep, heartfelt cry of someone who spends their whole life building. walls, and suddenly realizes they're trapped inside them. Inside the room, Kaio had been operating for 3 hours. The silence was absolute, broken only by the monitor's beeps and the precise instructions he gave in a low voice. Marcos, beside him, passed the instruments with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from reverence. I had never seen anyone operate like that before. Every movement was calculated, every decision, down to the millimeter. Kaio navigated a region of the skull where a 2-millimeter error could be irreversible, and he did so with the calm of someone forged not in luxury clinics, but in years of scarcity, of double shifts, of learning to do a lot with almost nothing. "I've found the third cavity," he murmured. "Irrigation." "By irrigating," Marcos replied. "Just 1 more millimeter." Kaio held his breath. The monitor triggered an alert. They all froze. 3 seconds of eternity. "Stabilizing," said the anesthesiologist in a firm voice. Kaio didn't stop. "Keep going. We're almost there." At 3:22 a.m., the doors opened. Kaio left with his lab coat stained, his mask around his neck, and his eyes tired. Renato stood up so quickly that he dropped his coffee cup. He is... "That's fine," said Kaio. "Successful surgery. We removed all the affected tissue. He'll wake up in a few hours. No lasting effects." Renato Cavalcante, owner of companies, mansions, and imported cars, collapsed. He literally bent his knees. In the cold corridor of the Idadru public hospital in the early morning, the most arrogant man Kaio had ever met fell to his knees in front of him and began to sob like a child. "Forgive me," his voice barely audible. "Forgive me for what I said. You saved my son. You saved my son by being the man I tried to diminish." Kaio stood still for a moment. Then he did something that nobody expected. He crouched down. He placed his hand on Renato's shoulder and helped him to stand up. "Get up, sir." Calm voice, no anger. "Your son will need you standing." Renato stood up, wiped his face with his hands, not caring about his expensive tie or who was watching. "Is there anything I can do?" "Anything. I have the resources. I can..." "You can," Kaio pointed to the hallway. "Did you see that wing over there? They lack equipment. They lack beds. They lack medication for people who have nowhere else to go." He looked Renato in the eyes. "If you want to do something, do it for them." Renato followed her gaze, and he saw, for the first time, the real hospital. Not the private room where he had placed his son. The outside corridor. The stretchers in the corridor. The tired faces. The families sleeping in plastic chairs. He saw the world that had always existed. The world he had always chosen not to see. 3 months later, the hospital's neurology ward received new equipment. Anonymous donation. But everyone knew who he was. Kaio arrived for his shift on a Tuesday morning and found an envelope in his office. Inside, AD handwritten letter. The handwriting of a man who wasn't used to apologizing, but was learning. "Dr. Kaio, there is no amount of money that could repay what you did, but there is respect, and you have mine, forever. Thank you for not giving up on my son, and for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." Kaio folded the letter. He put it in the pocket of his worn-out lab coat, and then he went to see the next patient. Share this with those who need to remember that humility is power, and that God honors those who truly serve.